In the otherwise tranquil city of Ikorodu, nestled in the heart of Lagos State, Nigeria, a sense of unease settled over its residents like a dark cloud around the year 2020 to 2021. This period would etch itself into the city's history as a time of unbridled violence and terror, courtesy of one of the most brutal confraternity clashes to ravage the city in recent memory. The conflict, which would shake the very foundations of Ikorodu, was no ordinary fracas between rival groups. It was a descent into chaos, where the unthinkable became the norm, and the sacred bonds of brotherhood were callously discarded. One of the most heinous crimes committed during this tumultuous period was the brazen assassination of a young man by his own blood brother, in broad daylight, and in full view of a horrified public. This gruesome act, which sent shockwaves throughout the city, was a stark reminder of the depth of depravity to which the conflict had sunk. The conflagration that would eventually engulf Ikorodu began on the night of December 31, 2020. What started as a seemingly innocuous gathering of Black Axe confraternity members at a popular hangout spot in the city quickly spiraled out of control. The atmosphere, initially festive and celebratory, with music, dancing, and merriment, was abruptly shattered when members of the rival Airlord confraternity, armed to the teeth with guns, stormed the venue and unleashed a hail of bullets indiscriminately into the crowd. Panic and pandemonium erupted as the Black Axe members scrambled to flee the scene, with some managing to escape with injuries, while others were not so fortunate, meeting their untimely demise in the hail of gunfire. The senseless carnage that unfolded that fateful night marked the beginning of a protracted and bloody conflict, which would leave in its wake a trail of destruction, death, and devastation. As the city of Ikorodu teetered on the brink of chaos, its residents lived in constant fear of the marauding confraternity members, who seemed to operate with impunity, their actions fueled by a toxic mix of vengeance, hatred, and a lust for power. The once peaceful streets of Ikorodu had become a battleground, where the rule of law was constantly flouted, and the very fabric of society seemed to be unraveling before the eyes of its terrified citizens. The motivation behind the Airlord surprise attack on the Black Axe gathering remained shrouded in mystery, but the perpetrators claimed it was a retaliatory measure for past grievances. This act of aggression marked the beginning of a vicious cycle of violence, as both confraternities embarked on a campaign of mutual annihilation, with each side seeking to outdo the other in brutality and bloodshed. The once thriving streets of Ikorodu were transformed into a desolate and eerie landscape, as shop owners shuttered their businesses and residents cowered in fear, afraid to venture outdoors. The atmosphere was tense and foreboding, with an air of impending doom hanging precariously over the city like the sword of Damocles. The sound of gunfire and screams echoed through the deserted streets, as the confraternities continued their relentless pursuit of each other. It was amidst this maelstrom of violence that a heinous crime was committed, one that would shake the very foundations of the community and leave an indelible mark on the psyche of Ikorodu residents. In a shocking display of depravity, a young cultist, identified only by his alias Connor, callously murdered his own brother in cold blood. The events leading up to this tragic incident were nothing short of ominous. Connor, a sworn member of the Black Axe confraternity, had been tracking his elder brother, a perceived enemy of the group, with the intention of meting out a deadly form of justice. Connor's brother, unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows, had been enjoying a quiet evening at a local beer parlor, sipping on a cold beverage and socializing with friends. However, his momentary lapse into a sense of normalcy was brutally shattered by the arrival of Connor and his Black Axe cohorts. With a sense of ruthless determination etched on their faces, they stormed the beer parlor, dragging Connor's brother out into the night, where he was subjected to a vicious beating. As the patrons of the beer parlor fled in terror, abandoning their drinks and personal belongings, a lone figure emerged from the shadows, displaying a remarkable act of bravery in the face of unmitigated evil. A young woman, whose identity remains unknown, approached Connor and his cohorts, pleading with them to spare the life of Connor's brother. Despite her impassioned entreaties, Connor remained resolute in his determination to carry out the heinous act. With a chilling display of callousness, he raised his gun and fired a fatal shot into his brother's body, sending him crashing to the ground in a lifeless heap. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the deserted streets, a haunting reminder of the senseless violence that had consumed the city of Ikorodu. The brutal execution of his own blood brother by Connor, in broad daylight, served as a stark reminder of the warped sense of loyalty that defined the Confraternity War. This conflict, which ravaged the city, was a far cry from an ordinary confraternity clash. It was a descent into unmitigated chaos, where the most heinous crimes were perpetrated with impunity. During the heat of this conflict, a young man was publicly executed too. The publicly executed innocent man was a tragic victim of this senseless violence. His assassins, with a chilling display of callousness, openly admitted that they had intentionally targeted him, despite being fully aware that he was not a cultist. Their justification for this atrocity was that the victim had been a close friend of one of their rivals, a tenuous connection that sealed his fate. As the confraternity war raged on, the cultists became increasingly trigger-happy, assassinating anyone who aroused their suspicion, without bothering to establish any concrete evidence of their alleged rival affiliations. This reckless disregard for human life was a hallmark of the conflict, as the cultists, fueled by a toxic mix of vengeance and paranoia, continued their rampage of terror, leaving a trail of death and destruction in their wake. The city was gripped by fear, as the cultists, with their twisted code of loyalty and honor, wreaked havoc on innocent lives. The rule of law had broken down, and the authorities seemed powerless to stem the tide of violence. As the body count continued to rise, the people of the city lived in constant dread, wondering who would be the next victim of the cultists' deadly vendetta. The confraternity war had unleashed a maelstrom of violence, which threatened to consume everything in its path. The senseless killing of innocent people, the destruction of property, and the breakdown of law and order had created a sense of hopelessness and despair. The city was crying out for peace, for an end to the senseless bloodshed, and for the restoration of order and normalcy. But as long as the cultists continued to perpetuate their twisted ideology, the city would remain trapped in a cycle of violence and fear. The onus was on the authorities, community leaders, and individuals to come together and find a solution to this crisis, to reclaim their city from the grip of the cultists, and to restore peace and tranquility to the streets. The confraternity war that ravaged the city of Ikorodu was a particularly devastating conflict, marked by a level of brutality and senselessness that defied comprehension. As the violence escalated, it became increasingly clear that some cultists were exploiting the chaos to settle personal scores with individuals who had wronged them in the past. One of the most tragic casualties of this conflict was a vigilante who had been assassinated by the cultists. According to reports, the vigilante had a history of clashes with some of the cultists, who saw his murder as an opportunity to exact revenge. This senseless killing sent shockwaves through the community, highlighting the dangers posed by these cult groups and the need for urgent action to address the crisis. But the vigilante was not the only innocent victim of the confraternity war. Many non-cultists, including women, children, and the elderly, were caught in the crossfire, suffering injuries, losing loved ones, or being forced to flee their homes in search of safety. The conflict had created a climate of fear and uncertainty, where no one was immune to the violence and bloodshed. The fact that the confraternity war had led to the assassination of a brother by his own blood brother was a stark reminder of the dangers of cultism. The bonds of brotherhood and loyalty that existed within these cult groups had become twisted and distorted, leading individuals to commit atrocities that would have been unthinkable in any other context. The notion that blood is thicker than water had been turned on its head, as the confraternity bond had proven to be stronger than the ties of family and kinship. This was a sobering realization, highlighting the insidious nature of cultism and its ability to warp and corrupt even the strongest of relationships. As the people of Ikorodu struggled to come to terms with the devastation wrought by the confraternity war, it was clear that a concerted effort was needed to address the root causes of this violence. Cultism was a menace, a virus that had destroyed countless young lives and wreaked havoc on communities across the country. It was imperative that young people, in particular, were made aware of the dangers of cultism and the devastating consequences of getting involved with these groups. The allure of cultism, with its promise of power, protection, and a sense of belonging, may seem enticing to some, but it was a false promise, one that would ultimately lead to ruin and destruction. As the city of Ikorodu began the long and difficult process of healing and rebuilding, it was clear that the fight against cultism would be a long and challenging one. But it was a fight that was necessary, a fight that would require the collective efforts of individuals, communities, and governments to eradicate this scourge and create a safer, more peaceful society for all. So, let us say no to cultism, no to the violence, bloodshed, and destruction that it brings. Let us say yes to peace, yes to unity, and yes to the values of compassion, empathy, and respect that are essential for building strong, healthy communities. Together, we can create a brighter future, free from the menace of cultism and its destructive influence.